Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the National Gallery of Australia and the 4th National Visual Art Education Conference with its theme, At the Heart. My name is Katie Russell and I'm the Head of Education here at the Gallery. And it's wonderful to see you all here, gathered before the beginning of the school year to be invigorated about art. I remember that some years ago when car number plates were issued to Canberra for ACT residents, the little tagline at the bottom of the number plate said, Canberra, heart of the nation. And I remember everyone used to comment on that and say, oh, really? I think that's slightly spurious as a claim. But what I know is that for the next 3 days, Canberra is going to be the heart of the nation and the heart of the discussion about art education and its place in this country and in schools across this country. So to get started, it's my great pleasure and privilege to welcome to the stage Ngunnawal Ngambri man Paul House to welcome us to country.
Wurrugawurri. Thank you, Katie. Baladu Yaba, Ngambri Ngunnawal Nyang. I'm speaking Ngambri Ngunnawal language. And in language, I'd like to welcome you all. Esay Jumburubura Marambang, Yilangalangbu, Gibabunga Wogabo Migabo, there are Nilbang Mayin. Ladies and gentlemen, young men, young women, distinguished guests, Yari Njamali Ngambri, Woglu, Wallablow, Ngunnawal, Mujigang, Yanangbu Jayandu. My respects to Ngambri Ngunnawal, Wallaboloa, elders past and present, Yari Njamarabu, Mujigangu, Nurumbanjigul, Ninyi Yiridu. My respects to all people from other parts of the country here today. Ngambri Ngunnawal Mayin, Gayambanya Nyinyoga, Nurumbangu Dara. Ngambri Ngunnawal people, welcome you all to country. Just want to share some images. Mijin Boulder, Paul House Girawa. My name is Paul House. I was born here at the centre of my ancestral country at the old Canberra Hospital, the heart of the nation. When our ancestors first met Europeans on the horizon in the 1820s, our European ancestors asked our Ngambri Ngunnawal ancestors, what do you call this place? And our ancestors didn't respond by saying the barbecue area. The different response, the different renditions of the word Canberra came back. I just wanted to share some of this story about my mother, Matilda House. And a little bit further to the north of country, also non-Aboriginal people asked our ancestors, where are we? And our ancestors simply responded by saying Ngunnawal. In Ngunnawal, in language, Ngunnawal means here. Where else are we? And we've been trying hard to educate government in particular, government at a local level and a federal level, for a long time about country, our connection to country, which is powerful and compelling, and which clearly links us to our ancestral lands, countries and waters. And our welcome to countries are made in the spirit of peace and a desire for harmony for all peoples of the modern ACT and surrounds. And our main aim is to establish an atmosphere of mutual respect through the acknowledgement of our ancestors and the recognition of our rights to declare our special place in the pre and post contact of the region. And as local custodians, we warmly welcome everyone now living and working on our ancestral lands. And with that, we talk about a whole range of values and interests and priorities. Here's an image of my mother on Arambi, on the fringe. My mother grew up on a dirt floor, like many Aboriginal people around her age. Grew up in poverty on the fringe of town, fringe dwellers. And I'll just go back in time a little bit here, and Mum apologises she can't be here today as well, so she's busy, but she apologised and she wanted me to share some of her story with you as part of the Welcome to Country. And we know that a picture paints 1,000 words, and they do. We're lucky to have images of our ancestors, and I'm going to share some more here of our ancestors. And we talk about how our mothers, our matriarchs, we honour our mothers, our matriarchs, and we talk about how we have cared for Mother Earth since the dawn of time. And evidence of our occupation can be seen everywhere throughout the country. Our signature is in the land, not just our DNA. And we know that land, Nurrumbungu Dara, our country land, is powerful and it sustains life. So we talk about sustainability. Our ancestors were the ultimate sustainers, weren't they? And with that story, back to Capitol Hill, Kurrajong Hill, Buthangariyala in language means to speak the truth. And we send that message to Capitol Hill all the time, every day, about politicians and bureaucrats speaking the truth. Speaking the historical truths, very important. And the historical truths can be found everywhere, in particular places like the National Library, where we see documents, ethno-historical records. So it's not all bad. About European culture, there was a big effort to record from some people our story and our connection to country. So I just wanted to share some of these images with you of country, but it's more about the images, and we talk about we continue to respect our obligations to look after our culture and heritage and our connection to our country. And places like that NGA house, it's important that these stories are passed on and protected, and places like the NGA that house these stories, very important. And we know a lot about country, know a lot about story and through language. And we talk about the land, the plants, the animals. It's all connected, not just environmentally, but also spiritually. So that image is, that's my mother and my grandmother, Pearlie Simpson. She was a Pajong Gundungara Ngunnawal Wallabaloa lady, just here to the north of country. And my grandmother ended up on Arambi, 32 acres under the White Australia policy, under the Aboriginal Protection Act, here just the north of Canberra. And also my mother was born on Arambi as well. And I mentioned earlier the different renditions of the word Nyambri were heard by Europeans on the horizon in the 1820s in this region here. So the river out here was turned into the Nyambri River, also the Nyambri Creek, which is Sullivan's Creek that runs through the ANU. They're all renamed. In particular, the Lake Burley Griffin was given the name Molongoola, or Molongolo, which is one of our Ngarigo words to the south that comes through country. And the rivers, the rivers, the billows are very important. We know that, and we can see the big debate around water at the moment. But we talk about the different renditions of the word Nyambri, and when I grew up, so basically when I went to school, I'm a product of public education system, which failed all of us, most of Indigenous people, Aboriginal people in the region here. However, it didn't stop us to go on and seek education at a high level as well. So it was important that this is the historical truths about naming, and why we know so much about the name is the ethno-historical records. And at the old maps, stock and station ledgers, a whole range of births and deaths and marriages, a whole range of documents. And it was named Canberra Station in 1834 by J.J. Moore, who was a non-Aboriginal property owner, where the NMA stands today, the National Museum of Australia, and part of the ANU, and he named his property Canberra Station under the New South Wales colonial government. And and you can see how the word Canberra has sort of evolved today from the word Nyambri into Canberra into Canberra. And these are three images of my grandfather to the right, Doug, my great-grandfather to the left here, Lightning Williams, Harold, and my great-great-grandfather, Henry Williams. And this is just one side of my Aboriginal ancestry on my mother's side. And so Henry in the middle, Henry was born, is a tribal son of an Aboriginal warrior who was born on country here at a place called Wirrawah. Wirrawah is Lake George. You may have heard of Lake George. And he was born at a place called Ali Yongyigar Creek, and his name was romanised into Onyong. And he was the father of Henry here, or Goobra, my great-great-grandfather Goobra. And Goobra was the father of Lightning, and Lightning, the father of Doug. And Doug is my grandfather Doug is my mother Matilda's father. Does it all make sense? So I want to just quickly go through images of, that's Nulungbang, Kurungbang, which is Yankee Hat. So all of our place names, majority of them have been romanised, anglicised here in the southeast, but we're on the journey of giving them back their proper names. You know, it's appropriate to give them back the proper name. So we talk about country. We know that country expanded and contracted for thousands of years, long before Europeans arrived, and it would have done so after the arrival of Europeans. So the expansion of country meant a lot of things in pre-contact times, and we know that our ancestors had strong, powerful trading connections with each other here in the southeast. So a little bit to the north, Burrawa, Ngunnawal speaking, Wallabalo people here on country here, Nyambri, Gumal, Walgaloo speaking. To the west, Wiradjuri, and to the north, east a little bit, Gundungara, Pajong speaking ancestry, and to the south, Ngarigo, Manaroo, Ngarigo speaking, and on the south coast, Dharawal and Duraga speaking. And I just wanted to show you some of the highlights of my mother. So my mother, Matilda, was born on Arambi, and she left Arambi in 1963. And as you can see through there, some of the highlights, she worked hard all her life as an Aboriginal activist, but you know, she was a matriarch more than an activist, as much as an activist, and fought hard for all Aboriginal women and all women in general. And some of the highlights, she went on to be named the Canberra Citizen of the Year on the journey, and just recently in 2017 she was awarded an honorary doctorate from the ANU for her efforts in Aboriginal rights in this country and non-Aboriginal relationships. Mum does a fair bit of hobnobbing. No, but we were able to forge, you know, partnerships and relationships with people, non-Aboriginal people at all levels of government, and we take that serious. Our diplomacy and partnerships with people right across the country. And Mum was able to do a whole range of things in her short life. She's going strong, and I'll just quickly come through some of that. So we continue our connection to country. Through law and custom, we hold knowledge as Aboriginal people here in a contemporary society. They're my daughters, Bella and Bo. They're 18 now. They're twins. They get different genetics through the family, which is good. And Mum there so Mum was able to share, you know, the 42nd, 43rd, and 44th opening of federal parliament with Kevin Rudd and Julia, back to Kevin, and then to Tony Abbott, then back to Tony Abbott, and so you know, all this stuff is good. It's all good. It's very symbolic. It's good, but deep down we need, you know, it needs to be more compelling for us. It needs to be more constructive. It needs to be more tangible, and we understand that through that legislation and policy plays a big key role in that. But action from people on the ground. So that image there, map of country, which is important. So we talk about our totems here on the southeast. So the Yukumbruk, divided into two, like Moitis, a bit like Dua and Yirija up in Yarnum land. Here in the south, it's the crow and the mullion, the eagle. So crow, Yukumbruk, and the mullion, the eagle hawk. So we're divided into two clans here in the southeast. So we can see a map of country. This map is based on the ethno-historical records. and it's based on where our people were camped when Europeans arrived on the horizon. There's lots of other images here I wanted to share, but I know that I've only got so much time for the Welcome to Country, and I just wanted to talk about the law of the land. And the law of the land talks about giving respect and honour to all people in all parts of the country, and being patient, going slow, hold fast to each other, and empower each other. There's some of the law of the land, but also looking after country. We know that looking after country, not just country, but sky country. So everything on the land comes from the sky. Some more images there. I'll just quickly flick through. There's an image of my great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother. My great-great-grandfather here was Frederick Freeman, and he lived to 105. And he was born in 1860 and died in 1965, and he lived here on country. He drank black tea and water. He didn't drink, and he played the fiddle. He was a talented man. His father was a traditional man called Robert Freeman, who was a black tracker who rode a horse all the way from Port Stephens, Nelson's Bay, and came down and married his wife, a Wiradjuri woman called Kwandong, at Wallenbean, a place called Marama, not far from Brungle. And as you know, our people were badged and labelled over the years by non-Aboriginal people. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say looking after the land and the rivers is very important, and we know that if we look after the land and the rivers, they'll look after us. So in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to say, and on behalf of our matriarchs and patriarchs, I say, Gurabari, welcome. One story though before I go. It's a story you may have heard, probably not though. In language, when our ancestors first saw sheep, the only word that they could describe the sheep here in the 1820s was with the word Jumbak. And the word Jumbak has been Romanised into Jumbak. And in language, Jumbak means small clouds of smoke. And that word now is legend, and it's spread right across the country, right across the world actually. And we have lots of interesting stories that describe our connection and our perspective on European culture and the arrival of it. So in the spirit of reconciliation, I say, Wurruguri, thank you, and Gurabari, welcome. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul, for that lovely and heartfelt welcome to country. The National Gallery, as you have heard, stands on Ngunnawal Ngambri land, and we are the occupying custodians of, in this building, the largest public collection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art in this country, in the world, in fact. So it behoves us to live up to our responsibilities, to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners whenever we have the opportunity and through in all our actions. So with that, I commit myself and the National Gallery to ongoing acts of reconciliation and recognition of the traditional custodians of this land. So, the National Visual Art Education Conference at the National Gallery of Australia. At the heart of the nation, we hope. There's so much to do while here, not only in the building and outside the building, but they're the things I'm going to highlight for you this morning. While you're here, please take the opportunity to partake of either a dawn or a dusk cycle in the James Turrell Sky Space out in what we call our front yard or Australian garden. It is truly a transformational art experience and a unique one in the Southern Hemisphere. And you can find the optimal times for those cycles, because of course it's dependent on the when the dawn and dusk actually takes place, on our website, or ask any of our visitor experience staff or the people at the registration desk in the Gandal Hall. Inside the building, of course, is our magnificent collection. And we'll be talking a lot today about our collection, its potential, and what artists do with our collection today and across the conference. So please immerse yourself in the collection of the National Gallery of Australia. And there are some fantastic displays, some which take more time, that's up to you, than others. But please, in any breakout session, or even when you just feel like you need a break from all of the talk, please get out into the art. If you venture right down to our former sculpture gallery, there is an installation called Bodies of Art in galleries 9 and 10 at the bottom of the gallery, right down the ramps to, on the way to the cafe, which is an interpretation of our collection through the lens of the human body, and it's very interesting, especially because a number of collection works that have been off-site and distributed around the nation have all returned for that particular display and will be here for the foreseeable, so it's very well worth a look. Also, we have recently unveiled an installation by Yayoi Kusama, and that's an immersive experience as well, and that's on level 2, so please partake of that. There's so much news about what's happening at the National Gallery of Australia, and so that's so wonderful that we've gathered you all here to share that news. And you'll hear it and you'll read it in your packs, but also as we talk across the next few days. But one thing I'd like to announce is that the gallery will be opening 2 new creative learning spaces in the middle of this year, devoted to learning through our collection. And it's very exciting. These are all in development now, and it's a great moment for education, art education in this country, to have the focus on the national collection, which belongs to everyone in this country, and through the lens of education. So please keep your eyes and ears out for those new learning spaces in the National Gallery. There's also a new, easier way to book and bring your students to the National Gallery and other Canberra institutions. Launching at the end of this month, tour operators and travel bookers for schools, including teachers, will be able to access a new portal which you can see availability for all Canberra institutions, a number of Canberra institutions at one place for your school visit. And that will be called Book Canberra Excursions. I'm sure there's information about it available through our educators, but also in your pack. We really want to know what you need from us as your National Gallery. So throughout the conference, in the registration area in Gandal Hall, there will be an education help desk. Please take the opportunity to tell us what you, your school and your students would like to see the gallery do, either here, on site in Canberra, online. What resources do you want and what would you find most useful from us or to work on with us? And across the country, where would you like to see us appear with our outreach activity and travelling programs? Please let us know. No request is too big or too small for us at the National Gallery. We can't do what we do without support. It's a big enterprise, it's a big ship. And the National Visual Art Education Conference and all of the National Gallery's learning programs are generously supported by the Timothy Fairfax Fund for Education. Tim Fairfax has recently renewed his pledge, and we are enormously grateful for his commitment to the Gallery's art education initiatives, which have allowed us to offer all of our education programs free of charge for Australian students for the first time ever. That starts this month, so thank you, Tim. We couldn't do it without you. The School of Life bring us our keynote speaker today, John Armstrong, presenting on artist therapy. Our art supply sponsor is S&S. Art Education Australia, who, as well as providing sponsorship, will publish a special issue of the Art Education Australia Journal, capturing the key learnings from this conference. So don't feel like you need to take copious notes, it will be put down. Art Monthly Australasia, you'll find the summer issue in your packs. And Hotel Realm, who are hosting many of our speakers. This year, again, another first, we have provided conference bursaries to support educators' attendance, to enable teachers from remote and regional areas or those not receiving financial support from their school to attend. And we thank the art teacher networks in all states and territories for funding registrations, while the NGA has paid for travel for all of those teachers who received bursaries. So congratulations to you, and I hope you enjoy the experience. So now to our keynotes, and I think you'll see the strong themes that speak to the heart of what this conference is about coming through these keynotes. Our first keynote today is, as I mentioned before, John Armstrong, author and global philosopher-in-chief, what a title, for the School of Life. And his talk is titled Art as Therapy. His latest book, by the same title, is written jointly with his friend and longtime collaborator, the popular philosopher Alain de Botton. Our second keynote tomorrow is a co-presentation by Dr. Flossie Chua from Project Zero at Harvard University and Anne Smith from Independent Schools Victoria, and their theme is Shifting Paradigms, Thinking in and Through Contemporary Art. And on day 3, Sandra Jackson Dumont, the Frederick P. and Sandra P. Rose Chairman of Education from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, will be talking about, her talk is themed, I'll Take You There, Museums as Sites for Self-Reflection, Igniting Discussion and Challenging Assumptions. The artist speakers we have are, as you've seen in your program, Ben Quilty, Sally Smart and Lisa Rihana. All of these artists have in some way touched upon Australian art or art in this collection to make their own art. And I think it's very important that we see ourselves, and we do see ourselves, and even if it happens serendipitously, we are a site where artists use to take their art further. And that's something that a collection does just by existing. But we feel incredibly honoured to be the custodians of such an amazing collection. And so, yes, artists and their voice is incredibly important to the National Gallery, and as will become clear throughout this conference. If you have any burning questions for any of our speakers, particularly the artist speakers or the keynotes, we are using an app called Slido. And Slido is accessed online. You can download the app or just work on the internet at Slido, slido.com. And the event code for Slido for you to put your questions to the speakers, and they'll be moderated by the staff who are taking the questions, is NVAEC, NVAEC 2019. If you have any issues, please ask some of our staff. So now I will segue to our first speaker with a little anecdote. Last Friday, we concluded the 22nd iteration of the National Summer Arts Scholarship, an annual week-long opportunity for 16 students about to commence Year 12 to immerse themselves with the activity of the National Gallery and have artistic interactions. It's a somewhat punishing program, especially when it's conducted in 40-degree heat, yet it is transformative. And witnessing the students move from fear to self-mastery through that week is truly amazing, and a reminder, again, of the power of art. At the end of the week, during the graduation celebrations, the scholars took to the stage, a surprise to us, and serenaded us with Elvis Presley's version of I Can't Help Falling in Love with You. I tell you, there was not a dry eye in the house. And that's how we want all students and educators to feel about the National Gallery of Australia. Which brings me neatly back to the theme of our conference, At the Heart, and our first speaker. Many of you will know or know of Nick Mitzevich's trajectory, the groundbreaking exhibitions and art activations he's developed and presented over the last 2 decades in Australian regional, university, and most recently at the Art Gallery of South Australia. I could wow you with his vital stats and soaring visitor numbers. You can get that information elsewhere. He might even share it with you himself. What I think important to note is that Nick has been instrumental in changing the nature of art gallery visitation in this country and transforming what visitors can expect from art galleries. 6 months into his tenure at the National Gallery, Nick has brought a new energy to this institution. He's reminded us of what is great about what we have and energised us for the potential of what might be possible. Today, Nick will be speaking to us about artistic courage. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming the Director of the National Gallery of Australia, Nick Mitzevich.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the National Gallery. It's such a great pleasure to have so many of you here. The National Gallery, like so many important institutions in Australia, needs to be a protector of our cultural heritage, and also, more than just a protector, we need to be advancing our cultural agenda. And I think institutions like the National Gallery have an important role to play in leading social, cultural transformation because we're the custodians of history, we're the custodians of the passion and the commitment that artists make, and we're expected to be brave in the way that we might put things together. And today I'm going to be talking about artistic courage. And in a world of such acute politics, where the private and the public become so charged, in an era when social media puts the power of small voices and gives them the ability to amplify it, we become even more sensitive to things. That isn't actually a bad thing. The more voices that we have in our world, the better it is in some ways. But you have to have you have to be able to filter things. You have to have an ability to be able to work out what's static and what's heartening and what's nurturing. And I think that for institutions like ours, sometimes you become overly sensitive to issues that if things are pressure points, you engineer around them, or you think, let's take the easy path, let's not polarize our audience, let's not create an atmosphere where this will become a distraction. And so, you know, the propensity is that things become bland, that things become so engineered out, so risk averse, that the opportunities to have a sensible, critical debate, or to look at issues that actually make up what our world's about, become even more of a struggle. So today I wanted to talk about just a number of case studies, to talk about how you can be courageous about elevating the issues that are important in our world today. And I suppose for me, the most powerful artists are the ones that take the pulse of the world that we live in. And there's a number of them I'm going to talk about today. My job, and the job of our colleagues, is to really advance the voice of the artist. But to make sure that voice has a clarity, to make sure that voice also is within the conventions that contemporary society expects us to work within. And in some ways, that's what guides us. And I'm just going to start off with something that is quite extraordinary. You might know this picture. It's the most famous painting in an Australian collection. It's one of the most famous pictures in the world. Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles. This became the most famous picture not because of its artistic legacy, but because of the artistic impact it made in Australia. When this work was acquired and made public in 1973, the then Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, wrote on the acquisitions form, approve and release the price, in a diagonal script across the middle of the acquisitions document, not at the bottom of the paper where he was supposed to sign. It was an interesting and bold and courageous move. And we paid a record price for this work on the international art market, and a record price for the picture itself in Australia. The price sort of is irrelevant now, and people always ask me, how much is it worth today? And you know, we kind of paid around $2 million US for it in 1973, and it's kind of worth $500 million today. But the important thing about this picture is the courage that James Mollison, the inaugural gallery director, had, and the courage that the government and the Prime Minister had. This was an unconventional picture for an Australian audience that was not really familiar with the developments of abstract expressionism and the New York School, and the way that artists had really pushed what painting was about. And to pay the highest figure for an American painting and the highest price that an Australian institution had ever paid was quite a difficult political decision to make. But what was even more important was that it was a picture that lacked representation. It was a picture that appeared to have no skill. It was a picture that was hard to tell a narrative and a story about. You know, it's very easy to sell an artwork that has a narrative and that has a story attached. So this work had none of those things. But it was a bold step in the 20th century. This picture now is considered to be one of Jackson Pollock's most successful and most ambitious paintings that he ever undertook. So why did Mollison and Whitlam think that this was important? And I just want you to ponder that for a second, because after the acquisitions paper, signed, approved and released the price across the middle of it, was made public, every Australian newspaper, every radio bulletin and every TV news bulletin ran this as their lead story. Never in Australia's history has art taken over the lead bulletins. It was ubiquitous for a week or so in Australia. Everyone was discussing it. Everyone had an opinion. And art moved from the back page or the story that ends the news to being the lead. And the director, Whitlam, were derided for this decision. And many news bulletins ran the story that this was painted by a drunk. This had no artistic talent attached to it, and so on. You could name the cliches. And over the test of time, that courage in acquiring something extraordinary like this has now proved successful. Most art historians that review the 20th century would consider this to be one of the key masterworks of the century. And I always love the fact in art that the edge always becomes the middle ground. And at times we have to skid along the edge, because over time it will become the middle ground. It will become our reference points. And there are so many examples of things on the periphery, things that we initially reject because they're too hard to digest or they're not conventional, that they just become the middle ground. And it's heartening that James Mollison, the inaugural gallery director, is still alive today and still is fascinated by the history of this painting. And can see how a work that was derided as being rubbish and a waste of money has now entered the bastion of being a masterpiece. And so I think that this is a great example that demonstrates this institution's courage from the very beginning. Another work that I think has artistic courage at its heart is the Aboriginal Memorial, which you would have seen when you entered the building today. It was a work that was commissioned as part of the marking of the 200-year anniversary since white settlement. This work, conceived as a memorial for all of the lives that were lost over those 200 years, has at its heart cultural memory. This work continually reminds us that this country's history has lots of perspectives to it, and people losing their lives, and dispossession, and how one culture was totally changed by another. And this memorial, I think, is a really powerful metaphor for looking at the parts of our history that are dark, that are bleak, that involve the negatives, and to actually elevate this in 1988 was very important. Today we have a very different perspective. Australian culture now is open enough to even have a debate about the date and the significance of Australia Day. And that debate is bubbling around at the moment. And in 1988, this country didn't necessarily have the confidence in itself to have those sorts of discussions. Today, we have developed more confidence to be able to have those discussions. Unfortunately, the debate continues to be somewhat polarised by the conservatives and the free thinkers. We will know when we're much more confident when the middle ground has a greater voice. It's always the interesting perspective when the outer voices are the loudest. You know issues have a seriousness and a sophistication when... Oh, sorry. Oh, I just don't know what... Oh, sorry. You know when issues have a sophistication when the middle ground starts being able to join the discussion. And I think that's happening at the moment with about looking at nationhood, looking at how we acknowledge our Indigenous past and how we acknowledge the things that have happened since white settlement. And you saw that in the same-sex debate here in Australia, where the periphery had loud voices, and it wasn't until the middle ground had an opportunity to talk about these issues that we saw the debate really being harnessed. And this Aboriginal memorial is a very important statement about looking at the dark history that we have and how we might acknowledge that and move forward rather than remaining in a miasma of guilt and sorrow. And this work for me is a really powerful work that had such extraordinary courage in being able to raise this debate in 1988 and continues to inspire us and reminds us of our history and that art and the way that artists think about the present and the past helps us to imagine the future. This is not an artwork, this is an exhibition that I want to talk about. Don't Leave Me This Way, Art in the Age of AIDS, National Gallery of Australia. So this was an exhibition that the National Gallery conceived here at the from November 1994 to March 1995, at the height of the polarised debate about AIDS and how people that had AIDS certainly had a curse, a death wish on them, and also how they were treated like secondary citizens in Australia. And to put on an exhibition that took a very polarised social issue and put it in the context of a national institution was a very bold and courageous move for this institution. This exhibition today does not sound bold and courageous and risky. And again, it's because 15 years later, our society has a better understanding of things and has an ability to think about all of the bits and pieces that fit together and consider things, because knowledge is really powerful. And we know so much more about AIDS, and we know so much more about the society that we live in. And so I think that we have a much stronger empathetic approach to these issues than we did when we didn't know so much about AIDS. And for the National Gallery to put this exhibition on, to take a social and political issue and put it in the hands of artists and let artistic voices speak and let them be amplified was an incredibly courageous thing to do. And this exhibition worked because it was the voice of artists. There was a whole series of different perspectives that were raised. This was not one political agenda that the gallery was rolling out, that this was an exhibition that looked at the issue of AIDS from so many different approaches. And the voices were authentic, and they gave us an insight into this issue, into how it affects our society, into how it affects individuals. And I think that's what made this exhibition so important and also so transformative in how we saw art having a social and political voice, that it wasn't just a radical edge. And this exhibition, for me, also was quite influential in the way that institutions in Australia tackled difficult social and political issues. That the success of this exhibition encouraged other formal institutions to be able to have the confidence to raise these issues in their programming. And if this exhibition was held today, it would not raise the eyebrow of anyone, and you would have your school groups lined up to see it. But in 1994, it was a very different kind of attitude. And for me, this exhibition was a very important point to make, that this institution can have courage. I wanted to reflect on 3 artworks that may appear to be provocative. Well, they probably are. That's part of their motivation. But I chose 3, which were 3 of the most popular works of art in the collection of the Art Gallery of South Australia, where I was the director there for nearly a decade. And I wanted to start with Mark Quinn, Buck with a Cigar, 2009, made of bronze. This was my first acquisition at the Art Gallery of South Australia in 2010. So this is a portrait of someone called Buck. And Buck started his life as a woman, and over time realised that he felt much more comfortable in the skin of a man, and so spent 30 years transitioning to be a man, but decided to keep his genitals because he wanted to have some sexual activity. And Mark Quinn did a series of people that were on the periphery, on the edge of our society, people that didn't fit in, people that didn't meet the social norms, people that he wanted to celebrate, and he wanted them to have a voice because he thought that they had a validity, that their position in our society was authentic, that was real, that they should belong. And he made a series of sculptures that depicted a number of people that you would think, a number of people that sat on the periphery of society. And Buck was captured in all his glory, in great detail. His tattoos, his pecs, his beard, his 6-inch cigar, in a very sort of strong and masculine pose. All the work that Buck had done at the gym, transforming his body, was there. But what was also there, the petite hands, the petite feet, and the female genitalia. So this is not a sculpture that is a collage or a pastiche or an imagined form. It's not surreal. It's actually realistic, and it depicts Buck in all his glory and all his positivity and with great confidence. This was one of the most popular works, and what was fascinating about this work is when you started telling the story of Buck's journey, of how Buck found his place in the world and how he felt comfortable in his skin, was quite a fascinating journey. And Buck visited the gallery and visited the sculpture. And we heard Buck's wonderful and at times heartbreaking journey to find a sense of peace within his own body. And this work has some provocations. If you look carefully at some of the tattoos, there's Islamic script on the work. And it's not the sexuality that had really caused some issue. It was the fact that the Islamic script on this body could well be considered to be blasphemous. And so there was an issue in managing that provocation. It was not Buck's intention to at all be blasphemous in that manner. It wasn't the artist's intention. And so over the time that this work was on display, the only criticism that we got was that a member of the Islamic community felt that it was blasphemous. And the way that we handled it is that I actually invited the member of the Islamic community in, and we talked about Buck. And I told them a little bit about, I told them the whole story about Buck, and I showed them pictures, actual pictures of Buck, and Buck wrote them a letter as well. So, dealing with these sorts of issues is really important, and it's very important. I found that it's really important to deal with them directly and personally. And when you decide to go down a path of artistic courage, you actually have to entertain all of the sniping that you might get, because if you don't, they might fester and they may well engulf you. And so Buck was courageous on his journey to find a sense of comfort in himself. Mark Quinn, the artist, had an extraordinary sense of courage, and he continues to do. His practice is very much defined by artistic courage. The Art Gallery of South Australia needed to have some courage to make this acquisition, but the educators and the guides needed to be confident and needed to know the context of this work to make sure it wasn't polarised or it wasn't scandalised. And I think that this work is an important work in demonstrating that you can have a serious discussion and you can have a serious debate about issues that we're uncomfortable about, issues that you might be troubled to bring children in on. But if you use the story of the artist, the story of the sitter, and try to find a way through and find a way to put this work into context, that it becomes such an important metaphor for so many issues of people that have and at times feel marginalised, and that you put this work in a much wider context, and it helps with a sense of belonging. And I think the reason that this work is so powerful, it demonstrates that we need to be able to celebrate difference in our world. And I think from an education perspective, and also from a guiding perspective, guiding this sculpture for diverse groups, I think that that's a very important point to make, and to put a work into context I think it's critical. Even though, as I started, it is a provocation. And I think the cigar is the big provocation, not the genitalia. I wanted to talk about this work as well by Wim Delvoye, called Untitled Robert, 2004, Tattooed Pigskin. So from an aesthetic point of view, this work doesn't seem to be so provocative. It doesn't seem to be very courageous. It doesn't seem to be pushing the envelope. But let me just tell you a few little things about it. So Wim Delvoye owns a pig farm, and he grows his pigs. And as the pigs grow, tattoo artists sedate the pig and then tattoo the pig. And then when the pig gets to a certain age and the pig skin fits into a certain size frame, the pig is then slaughtered. Then the skin is then tanned and then the hair is removed, and the artwork is then produced, and that the tattoo remains on the skin. So there's a bit of courage here now, isn't there? Because animal rights and the issues around animal rights is a very potent and serious issue in our society. And Wim Delvoye obviously makes this as a provocation about the commercialisation of animals and how we treat animals in our world and how we commodify them. And he emulates the techniques that many of our producers that use animals in our world. And he adds another layer of provocation, that the image tattooed is the Saint of Guadalupe, the protector of animals. So there are multiple layers of provocation in here. And so we're having a social issue, the rights of animals. And it's intertwined with religion and ethics. And essentially this work is about our moral compass and our moral standards. But in that provocation, how different is this work from now I'm just going to lift my leg up, from my R.M. Williams boots. And the answer is not so much different. But what the artist is doing is really trying to elevate these issues and wants us to have a thoughtful discussion about the role and the way that we moderate our moral and ethical standards. And for me, this work is fascinating because many people can walk past it and not even notice it. and not even have an opinion about it, because it's not until you know the production and the story of this work that it becomes so charged that it forces us to have those discussions. But how extraordinary to use this work to have those discussions about ethics and morals, religion and animal rights, the rights of individuals, the rights of our society. This is such a magnet for all of those issues. And Wim Delvoye has so much courage that it's more than that. He's an artist that is on the edge of everything. And in 50 years' time, I hope I'm like fat, bald, and alive to actually see how we might think about Wim Delvoye and how an artist that so publicly skids along the edge is perceived by us today. And he still owns a pig farm. Out of all of the acquisitions that I made as director at the Art Gallery of South Australia, this was the one that we agonised over the most. This was the one that caused significant debate at the trustee level. And in the end, the discussion was to accept this work because it had so many important social and political issues about the world we live in today, that this work is a provocation, but it's a provocation opening up the door for discussion about these very serious issues about the world we're in today. And I'm going to finish my third case study with a work that in some ways defined my tenure at the Art Gallery of South Australia. And I'm using this installation image from the Art Gallery of South Australia. The work in the centre is the Belgium artist's masterwork. Belinda Del Brucia is the artist, and the work is titled "We Are All Flesh." And the work was made in 2011 and involves a 9-metre steel pole, an epoxy sculpture made out of resin, and tanned horse skins wrapped around the epoxy sculptures. And these two horse sculptures, figure forms, are intertwined, and horse skins are then patchworked, wrapped around them. And so when this work went on display, the Adelaide-based daily newspaper, the Adelaide Advertiser, ran a story calling me the Butcher of North Terrace, and suggested in another follow-up story the next day, had suggested that I'd turned the gallery into a slaughterhouse. The day after that story, we had 5,000 visitors the next day. All publicity is good publicity. This was probably the most provocative work to be on display, not just because of its content, but because it was placed in a gallery space that had traditionally been the gallery space of 15th century paintings, and where the sculpture was positioned was where a 15th century altarpiece sat for 15 years. So the altarpiece was removed, and the wall that the altarpiece was on, and then a 9-metre pole was installed with the 2 entwined horses hanging from the pole. And I knew that this work would be an incredible provocation, both the content and its positioning and location. Of course, I removed the altarpiece and put this in specifically to replace it, to heighten the effect. At times we need to be show people, but also not just being scandalous for scandal's sake. This was making a very important statement that art has such a critical role to talk about very serious issues of our times. Now, I knew that this would be a provocation. I didn't think that I'd be called the butcher of North Terrace, nor did I think that that the gallery would be considered to be a slaughterhouse. However, I'm not as creative as the editors at the Advertiser. But I knew that this was an important work that would polarise visitors. Because the equine form, the horse in our culture and society, has such a close affinity to us. In Western society, we mainly have horses as helpers, as companions, and they're much loved. And to string one up is quite a provocation. Also, I was reminded of this from the beginning of my journey with this acquisition, that because my personal assistant at the Art Gallery of South Australia was a horse lover, and she had racehorses, and that was her hobby. And her desk and all the figurines above her shelf had pictures of her own horses, of horse figurines, anything to do with equine culture. Was covered her desk. And when I went away overseas, I would buy, her name's Lindsay, I would buy her a little gift somewhere from my journey. And so I added to her own personal collection of images of horses. Sometimes it was a snow dome, sometimes it was a 3D card, sometimes it was a little porcelain figurine. So I myself contributed to the horse altar that I had to look at every single day and hear her horse stories, and her telling me that she had a rough night because she had to get up at 1 a.m. because a storm came over, and she went to the back paddock to make sure that she put the horse coats onto the horses so they wouldn't be cold, and so she was a bit grouchy. So I knew from a very personal perspective that the horse was such an important animal to her personally, and that she would hold me accountable if I was to do something that really compromised that. So I was very much reminded of that. And so it's always good that it's so easy in some ways to be courageous, and but I think it's harder to make sure that you're aware of why you're being courageous, the why. And so this is where I want to pull all of these courageous stories together. It's the why that's so powerful, and the context. Why did I want to hang this sculpture up? Why did I think it was important? And as an artistic director, it's important to be able to articulate why, and then to put it in a context so the full gamut of the voices that we'll have an opinion about, that they have a reference point. And, the marginal voices will be loud and the middle ground probably won't. And so it's important that everyone has an opportunity to be able to put this in a context. So when this work went on display, a whole room was conceived around it, from Rodin here at the front in the foreground, all the way through to Gilbert and George at the back with the big black and white photograph, looking at 500 years of art making where artists looked at the human condition, what it was like to be alive, what are the impacts of the human condition, and how throughout time do we capture loss? How do we capture the things that we have no control about in our world, the things that give us sorrow, the things that make us human, the things like emotions? The work was put in a context of 50 other works that looked at the human condition over 500 years. This was a powerful group of pictures and sculptures and decorative arts and photography that spoke to what the human condition looked like at a particular point in time in a particular place and culture. And by doing that, this work had a context. It had a lineage through history. It talked about the stories of artists and how they want to capture what defines the human condition through their eyes. And this work is powerful, it's gut-wrenching, but ultimately it has great clarity and it reminds us of the fragility of life. And many of our visitors, many of the Art Gallery South Australia's visitors, I'm still correcting myself, find this work so gut-wrenching and just so difficult to look at. It is the most popular room in the Art Gallery of South Australia. Most visitors cannot but go and see this. Many of them have told me they don't like it, but they don't deny its power. There are a number of donors that withdrew their donations to the gallery, but heartily over time they came back because they saw the effects of this work. They understood the context over time. We spent lots of energy working with our volunteers, working with our educators, and advising school groups that this was on display and putting a context behind the work. And it's the why that's important in courage and being able to put things into context. So I end my brief case studies with those two words, why and context. Courage helps move society. It helps move thinking. It helps progress how we might understand complex issues. And courage in an artistic point, in an artistic frame, is about giving artists the voice and amplifying their voice to talk about difficult and complex issues that we are fearful of. And our jobs in being the custodian of an important public collection that needs to grow and develop becomes even more critical in the 21st century when so many voices can be heard. And I think public collections have such an important role to play in leading a cultural agenda and helping our society look and think about complex issues that are about the world we live in today. And I end today by saying that being courageous is not enough. Being thoughtful is important, and making sure that there is commitment and an ability to put these things into context. They're even more important than courage. Thank you very much.
Questions from the floor?
I always love questions.
Okay, well, I'll kick off with one. How's your relationship with Lindsay?
Lindsay got a 3D horse Christmas card from me. So she herself says to me that she doesn't like it, and she avoids walking through that gallery space because she loves horses so much. And even though the sculpture is not, what do you call when you stuff an animal? It's not taxidermy. It's an epoxy resin sculpture, and the horse skins are just stretched over the sculpture like a patchwork. So there's an abstractness to the sculpture, and so even though it's not real, the horse skin gives it a sense of reality. But her reaction is about the power of this work. Even though Lindsay tries to avoid going through that gallery space, it's just the power of the object that the work is so charged with.
Thank you. While everyone's getting used to the technology of Slido, we have got capacity to take questions from the floor. I will ask one that refers to your past history as a teacher, and one that's come in from one of our audience members. And it is, how do you balance the organic nature of the development of creativity, I'm presuming in students, with assessment requirements?
Well, I think it's all about the context and the frame that you give it. If you can put something in a historical and logical argument that has important reference points, I think that these things can coexist. And art is an accumulation of history, and to understand what's happening today means that one must reference the past, because the things that are happening today come from a historical lineage. Most people describe me, for example, as a contemporary art person, but actually I come out of a history of being an art teacher, and for many years lecturing in art history. And somehow when you buy dead horses or pigskins or transgender people made out of bronze, you're suddenly labelled a contemporary person. But all of these things come out of a historical background, and I think that it's important that you are always referencing the past and how history's informed the present.
Thank you. And thank you to the anonymous person who has used the technology for the live question. And here it is. What do you anticipate will be your most courageous act at the NGA?
And what I've learnt is that you never define it yourself. The institution, or really within an institution, institutions don't define their most courageous acts. It's the audience that does, and it's the impact that it makes on the audience. And James Mollison, when he acquired Blue Poles, I think had no idea that it would become such a polarising issue in society, and how the debate on the value of art would become so widespread. And I'm sure he never thought that the work would become emblematic of the institution either. So the audience ultimately decides that, and so your respondent needs to wait a bit to see what you all think will be it.
In comparison to where you've been in your career, are there more conservative pressures in the NGA now that you've come to the federal level than other galleries, perhaps?
I think it's the reverse. The National Gallery was a courageous act in itself. Starting up a national institution less than nearly 40 years ago, building a provocative Cole Madigan brutalist building, giving the most generous acquisitions budget in the 1970s. James Mollison, when he started collecting in 1971, had $7 million to spend a year, which was equivalent in today's money of $65 million. Like, so this institution, at its bedrock, was courageous, and those acts of initiating the institution itself, the act of building the collection, the provocative nature of the things that were collected in the 70s means that this is the most radical institution that I've ever worked at. And so I need to match that historical context. Maybe over the last couple of decades, it hasn't been as courageous as it could be. But I kind of want to look at the DNA of the institution, and the DNA of the institution is brave and bold in the way that it's been conceived, and it's my job to kind of advance the original DNA.
Okay, another question from the floor. You spoke of a middle ground, and consensus often changes society. But what about the people or visitors on the periphery and their courage, institutional acknowledgement of the courage that may be missing?
I think the people on the edge that have an opinion, their opinion's valid, and that's why I always think it's important to have a context. A diversity of views means that we're doing our job. I think that with art, consensus only comes with time. And when you look at things that have been produced within the last 10 years, you're not going to get a consensus of that. So it's important that people be able to have their views, and those views are moderated by a context that you might frame up around something.
Thank you. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question off the floor, or we all?
Let's have a live
Yes, we've got
question.
One down here.
Let's have a live one.
Yeah, let's have a real human question.
Thanks very much. The Blue Poles thing, it's worth $500 million maybe, and I imagine that there are some people who would say that it'd be a good idea to cash in on it, but I also think it'd be worth more to Australia to keep it there, but I don't really know.
That's a good question. I think cashing in on it will undermine the cultural assets that we have. Our job and our mandate is to make the best art in the world available to Australians, and that Australians need to have the opportunity to see the best of things in their backyard. And so flogging this off means that we undermine the reason that we're here. And Australians must have the ability to see the best in the world. And this is a masterpiece of the 20th century. And I love this painting. Any of you, I should say, that follow me on social media, if you don't, Nick Mitzevich Instagram, join the 15,000 people that are already following me, so you don't miss a beat. I have put a number of posts up, like for the staff Christmas party. I became Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles, and last Monday I was wearing a Blue Poles tie. And I do that just to celebrate the important impact this picture has, because this picture actually opened up the debate of the value of art. And so it's important that this picture have a role in Australia, because from both an artistic point of view, being the most celebrated picture that Jackson Pollock's ever painted and a masterpiece of the 20th century, it's also the work that gave Australian society a reason to have a debate about the value of art and culture in our society. And so, would you sell the Opera House? Would you sell the Sydney Harbour Bridge? Things that are important in cultural milestones must be celebrated and retained, and I think that it's the easiest and the most foolhardy thing to do would be to flog off any of our cultural assets.
You defined courage beautifully, but you've got a very strong background in art. There are often artists that latch on to very popular controversial ideas, such as the Me Too movement, the gay and lesbian marriage debate that was just last year, that do that because that's the popular thing in the news at the time. And some galleries pick those works up. So do you think that, and how can this be done? Do you think that a re-education of what defines courage, true courage, needs to be explicated amongst educators, and the value of that to their students to be able to discern what true courage is in the artworks that they're examining?
I think that there are times where provocation is used as a strategy, and I suspect you're suggesting that times people are provocative to be popular. If a work or a body of work that artists make is just based on provocation, that it's a live issue in our society, and if their practice is just fulfilled by provocation, I think it's quite easy to discern that it's hollow. But I think if you can build the why around things, like putting the Belinda del Brucia in a historical context of 500 years, of juxtaposing Rodin with Belinda del Brucia, where Rodin used clay, plaster and bronze to define emotions. In the same way, 500 years later, Belinda del Brucia uses a steel pole, epoxy resin and some tanned horse hides to elicit emotion. I think that that really advances the ability for people to understand. And when you can take something that is known, that there is a level of comfort, that there's a solidity around it, and you can compare it with something that is unknown, that is a bit scary, or that you have no visual context with, and demonstrate that there is a similarity, a likeness, that this is just a contemporary extension of this, that this is the next step, that re-education can happen, that coming back to the context and the why, and building things around it. One of the works that is really a struggle is the pigskin, of course. But if you use the example of my boot, suddenly you can start having a discussion about things that you know about, because you know about your handbag, you know about the leather wrist strap on your watch, you know about the shoes on your feet, and you can start having a discussion about the things that you know. Stan Grant gave this really eloquent speech once, and in South Australia about 2 years ago, and he said that the most powerful thing about art is that it's the bridge that connects us with all the things we know and all the things we don't know. And that's the role of art. And I think that's such an eloquent thing to think about, and how we might bridge the gap between the things that we fear or the things we're unsure about and the things we know about.
Nick, thank you. Please join me in thanking Nick Mitzevich.
Thank you very much. Thank you.